Hello and welcome back to our second part conversation with Teddy Mazina, a photojournalist and artist presently based at the Royal Museum for Central Africa, otherwise known as the Africa Museum in Brussels. Now, Teddy, in the previous conversation, we spoke briefly about the role of the work you're doing with the Mzungu Tribes Project, which came out of a fictional laboratory, anthropometric measurements, and as our viewers will see, seeks to challenge racialized stereotypes that we inherited from colonialism around the world. I'm just interested to sort of, for you to expand a bit more on that, and then we'll just bring up the short film in terms of the work that you did with that. So if you could just sort of remind us again, because this sort of segues very nicely into the archival work that this segment is going to be talking to today.
Thank you again. Mzungu Tribe is a photographic project which started a few years from today, and it went through the stereotypes, racist and stereotypes created by the colonial propaganda in general. I can say it's a fiction or fiction reality, or reality which is a fiction, which try to understand how the colonial library, photographic library, because I am not a scientist, but I'm a photographer, and I was interested in to see where what have been produced on Africa in general by the Belgian colony as photography and as caption. So my work was how to bring the subject to the public and question the racism of today among Africans and among Africans and among continents and among countries. What's going on in the relationship between people? Like I come from a region in East Africa, Central East Africa, where we had a lot of trouble based on anthropometric measurement. Categorization of people, assignment of identities, which have been made by anthropologists at the colonial time, that people have taken as the truth, which is an alternative truth created by those people at the time. On the other side, you have the image of Africa and the image of Europe, which comes from, in the collective conscience collective, what they call conscience collective in Europe or in Africa, people think that they know what is the other one, the otherism or the alterity, what is the alterity. So Mzungu tribes come and question that through this fiction, through this lab in the 70s, through those students who were created this lab to question it, white and black, and who were arrested and for the African expelled from Belgium.
Yes. Adam, if we could cue that short film at this point in time, because it's actually very interesting what you do with the sort of that particular lab, right? That photo lab, because part of what I think I find quite fascinating in the work there is the ways in which, as you say, it challenges stereotypical conceptions, but also how you're using, and I know this is going to be very problematic, and it is quite problematic, but I'm going to use the language anyway, how you're using both black and white bodies, right? Simultaneously, which in itself kind of destabilizes the power fixities and the hierarchies that we've inherited from colonialism. So if you think about, for example, the ways that, it is black bodies that are approaching white bodies, black bodies that are touching black bodies that are touching white bodies, and how that sort of challenges the historic conception, right at the end of the film. As our viewers will see, Adam will cue up the first image, and in that first image we have, sort of a lineup of everybody in the lab, and this, it demonstrates precisely the point that I think you're trying to make, which is to say that the discourses that we inherit are not natural. The discourses that we inherit are invented. They are they were manufactured, right? And it is up to us as contemporary society to challenge those discourses. So I just want to, before we get into more of the sort of historical images and the more historical work, I'd like us to talk about that, which is to say, you know, and we did also, I think, in last week's episode also touch on this as well, to say, how is it that we as a society begin to challenge these stereotypes and begin to challenge these images? So I'm just curious about that, if you would like to say more about precisely that notion of the discourses that we inherit, the notion of alterity, right? And there's a lot of scholarship that's been developed around alterity. I remember a couple of years ago at the University of Pretoria, I actually hosted a conference on alterity, thinking about the ways in which, both in psychoanalytic theory as well as in philosophy, we've thought about the other, right? And just to say that it's all just really been invention. It's all really just been ways in which society or individuals in society have attempted to classify, categorize, and control people in society.
There's I work on different layers. This project had many layers in it. So you have all these massive production of images and of lyrics, of captions, which have been created at the time and which have been actually used as postcards, as books, as to support the discourse which was at the time made. And it's a whole continent which was curated by few people, who didn't know. For most of them, those photographers didn't know, they were not scientists at the same time. So you have all this production which was used as to create an image of the other, of the sauvage, to invent the idea of Africa. So this project comes and question what came from this production of discourse and images, and to try to talk about them without anger, without creating once again a black man with dreadlocks is coming and say, oh, okay, now racism everywhere. Yes, there is, but the question is, how do those images affect us today? We as African people, Europe as European people, and how does it affect the policies? How those images inhabited, I don't know if I can use the word, inhabited our collective memories, if you've seen them or not. But everybody have an idea what is Africa, the hierarchy between continents, the hierarchy between civilizations, the hierarchy between cultures and art and everything. So it all comes from there. Yes. And it has been so spread for the Belgian society in general, or the French one, that I know better than America. It has been so spread that everyone has a picture or postcard somewhere left by his uncle or his grandmother. Somewhere, everybody have seen a cannibal on a postcard. So it was distributed, it was sent from Africa to the families left home. It was distributed during human zoos, It was sold or given like a souvenir. Yes. A picture of the cannibal, a picture of the woman, the naked topless woman, a black woman, a picture of the Arab, this or that, with his camel, and so and so. So you have all this that affected or still affect our relationships. And in Africa, the assignment and the hierarchies between communities which were like living together, I'm not saying that it was a paradise because people were fighting, there was fight for power and this or that, but today you still have what they keep calling tribal wars or ethnic crises, killings, which comes from those differences made at the time. So Muzungu tribes is questioning all that. How my fiction, which looks like a real story, is a fake news, and how what have been told is a fake news. So, and we are on the era of fake news and social media and so and so. So I'm questioning all those levels to bring people to question themselves of if what they see is true or not.
Now, Teddy, you mentioned something as well, and we had a bit of a conversation that, and you made a comment that I found very insightful off camera. And you said, the proliferation of racist ideologies in Europe are such that, for example, black soccer players, often when they approach, when they're handling the ball, you'll have an entire stadium of about 25, 50,000 people making particular gestures, gesticulating to sort of quote unquote classify the soccer player as a monkey, as a baboon, etc. Thinking about all of those historical narratives. I'm interested in terms of, as you say, the ways in which the collective consciousness of Europe has bought into the racist ideologies that were developed and propagated by colonial anthropologists, by colonial linguists and philologists as well, because language plays a fundamental role in the creation and the perpetuation of these racist ideologies. So I'm interested first in that aspect, and this then sort of brings us in very nicely to the work that you have quote unquote discovered. Right. If we and I don't quite like the concept of discovery, because it's not as if the work wasn't there, but the work that you've encountered. Yes, I think that's a better concept. The work that you've encountered in the Africa Museum in Brussels, right, in terms of tracing to the T the archival sources that then gave us the postcards, that then gave us the stamps, that then gave us all of these
cartoons.
Exactly. You see what I mean? So I'm interested in that, to say, for example, if you as Teddy Mazina were to walk out onto the streets in Brussels and be like, do you know where these sort of weird ways of treating a black football player come from? Whether people would know that, and how that intersects with exactly these tons and tons and tons of images and histories that lie locked up in institutional basements, in institutional repositories, institutional archives. And I suppose the other thing that I want to ask, and I know I'm sort of asking you a number of questions here, but the other question that I would then have out of that is to say, how, for example, is the Africa Museum confronting itself in terms of its own role and place? Or is it just seeing itself as an institution that holds these repositories and doesn't necessarily have to engage with its function in the curation of these ideologies
many
in society?
questions.
I know.
Like, let's go from the stadiums. The stadiums were very interesting for me, because I started to question myself, okay, everybody is not racist, right? But how come 3,000 people at the same time? I say 3,000. Not all the stadium, it's a part of the stadium, can at the same time make the same noise and think, because a black man is playing or he's doing well on the ground. So let's say they're not racist, but it comes from somewhere. There's an idea in everywhere, and it's not only people who didn't go to school. It's not only it's all people from the whole classes of the community or the society. So the idea is still there, but it comes from somewhere. So for me as a photographer or as an archivist, the question was to try to understand how so many people can think the same, and how those people are working for the government, those people are working for the private sector, and etc. And how sick is the society, and why does it come from? How can we understand why fake news have been spread in time, the colonial time, and it's still remaining there, even if everybody is denying. If you ask football authorities, if you ask the government, they would say, no, it's a small problem, we're going to sort it out. And then next year,
it happens again.
It happens again. And now they have started to sanction, even for, racism comes from everywhere, so you have it with minorities, other kind of minorities as well. So the question was how to, me as a photographer in my sector, to go and dig. And what I found was big. To come to the Africa Museum, I always tell them, this is a crime. It's like a crime scene. You know, Africa Museum, you can find all the evidence of what happened in the Congo. What you know, you have artifacts, but you have all those pictures. You have you know, so many things to learn and see. But the Africa Museum is as sick as its own history, you know. It's trying to transform. It's very difficult. Some activists don't like it, don't go there. Some other goes. But what they did, what is interesting, is that they opened the archives. Personally, I told them those archives cannot go out now because people we see on the pictures maybe are parents of nowadays Belgian or some Congolese, and what you say about them, it's quite, it's very racist. So we need to study, talk about it, and see how we can do the retribution to Africa of all these images and history and tracks, because people need them, because you can say, okay, this comes, this village, this is the village, but there's no name of anyone because no black man has a name on those pictures. That's why my project is called My Name is Nobody, you know, the sub-project of Muzungu tribes. You won't find any name on the pictures. You will find, you know, the place, the river, or the you know, the landscape, but not people. So what is interesting today is to access to those archives, which was not possible a few years ago, and to try to take them back and use them to actually to recover traces of how were people living, and get rid of the stereotypes before we as African people and after as a community. But it's on a small level. I mean, I'm just a photographer, you know.
Now, Teddy, that's a very interesting concept that you're putting out to us and to our viewers. And I think this is a revolving concept of repatriation, right? So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had my good friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Clunas. And it's also interesting because Sarah's the chief curator of the Africa collection at the Peabody here at Harvard University. And one of the conversations, or one of the things that Sarah says to us and to our viewership, is that, you know, she's cautious about notions of just blanket repatriation, right? And it's interesting, of course, because she's dealing with the Benin bronzes, right? So that conversation was specifically with the Benin bronzes, calls for the repatriation of Benin bronzes, and that has been a global discourse, you know, featuring folks here in the United States, folks in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has said no, they don't want to repatriate. They think, in fact, actually, that they would do better not to repatriate, etc. You know, all of these nonsensical sort of things. But in the sense of an image, in the sense of a photograph, I wonder, Teddy, if, because the Benin bronze, it's very simple, right? You take it back to the Oba. In Nigeria, you take it back to, and in fact, that's the idea, because these particular, artifacts were in the Oba's palace, right? So they were part and parcel of court life. As Sarah told us a couple of weeks ago, they were part and parcel of the sort of cultural institutions. When we're talking about the repatriation of images, I'm curious about how we do that, right? So is it a matter of thinking about the geographical location where the images were taken and trying to find the descendants of the people? Is it about repatriating them to other institutions? For example, in the Congo, right? Cultural institutions, be they museums, be they exhibition spaces, be they, you know, whatever sort of cultural space that can be able to hold those artifacts. And also taking care of the sensitivity of the ethics of the humans who are depicted in these images, right? So I'm thinking about
I go from you talked about this picture of this white picture of Muzungu tribes lab, the big one, the colored one. I did it because it looks it's not to be shocking, but a little bit to reverse and question people. So how do we look at pictures and what do we think about what we see and what is true or not? So the repatriation of images is at multiple levels. Is first to recover or to get access to the past in a way. You know, how was Africa at the time? Photographers and ethnographs and other people depicted this Africa like a wild Africa, like they were trying to change people. You know, they talk about cannibals, they talk about, you know, this or that, this culture was like this, it was not good. And the idea is how do we look at ourselves? Because the alienation that Fanon talks about, you know, was to take the African people from what they were and to transform them
into something else.
Into something else. So the repatriation of those images brings at least an idea of the aesthetics that we had, of how it was. You know, what we can even recover a minimum of an idea of what was the artisanal, how people were dressed, how people were celebrating this or that. So you repatriate faces, maybe you can, some people can recognize someone on the picture or from oral transmission and so, but on the other side you recover your own self, you know, to have a picture of your own village in the, you know, in the early, late 90s is fundamental to recreate, you know, to rebuild Africa and to recover the small pieces left from that history that became, after Christianization or Islamization of Africa, became like what we don't want to see as Africa. So there's an effort to be made, even for us. Some refuses.
Yes.
For some artifacts, some community refuses because now they are scared of their own selves.
Yes.
So it's repatriation is not only to take the artifacts or the images or books or whatever. It's to recover who we are.
It's a process of self-constitution, as it were.
Reconstitution, I think. You know, yeah. In some communities, for like pieces of human bodies, because you have human bodies, African human bodies. In Europe, some communities in the Congo have refused to get them back. They don't want them. They're scared of them. They're scared of them own self. So you can see how it's still a process of decolonization itself.
Of course.
Bringing them back is not. Some say you have to give back what you have taken, and some says no. So there's still even a conflict among Africans.
There's a really interesting thing around that. So one of our colleagues, and definitely a senior of mine, Professor Jacob Olupona, is a professor of religion, African religion specifically here at Harvard University. And he talks about this idea of why certain individuals, for example, don't want particular artifacts coming back. And I think, you know, the argument that he makes is that they don't want these images coming back because individuals don't know in terms of the metaphysics how to handle these images, or not these images, rather these artifacts, right? So, for example, say, and there are myths, of course, that are sustained by these images. So, for example, if a museum says, oh, we want to repatriate a particular artifact that was used in a particular ritual, etc., individuals will say, no, we don't want it back because we know the kind of power, the kind of magic, the kind of mythology that surrounds that particular object, right? But I did want to sort of go to something that you raised, which comes as a result of another colleague of mine who reached out recently to me. He's based at SOAS Umduduzi, and he's also a curator. And he says to me, oh, the work that you're doing is so impressive and it's so interesting. I'm interested in terms of your take. He's asking me about this. He says, I'm interested in your take of what we would call Iqaba aesthetic, right? So I do work on indigenous epistemology, indigenous ontology, indigenous metaphysics, specifically as it locates, as we find it in the South African context. And he says, in terms of indigeneity, what form of aesthetic does indigeneity exhibit? And my response to him, and this is, it goes back to say the repatriation of images can give us an understanding of the type of aesthetic that we exhibited. And I said to him, Mtujuzi, what is an aesthetic exactly, right? Like what, because especially in the context of the people that I work with and the kind of lives that I am trying to analyze and understand in my own theorization and analysis, I find that the concept of an aesthetic or aesthetics doesn't quite fit, right? Because if we think about how aesthetics develops, we've got the Kantian critique of judgment, right? Which is sort of the big sort of starting out philosophical treatise that gives us the distinctions of the beautiful, the sublime, the aesthetic. Then you've got, you know, in more recent years, in any case, the work of Hans Gadamer in the 1980s, where he talks to truth and method, how the aesthetic is situated in the social sciences through methodology, again, the beautiful, the sublime, the aesthetic. Now, when it comes to indigenous communities across the African continent pre-colonial, I don't have the vocabulary for the concept of the aesthetic within those communities. And I wonder if as artists, you know, you guys can assist us in that, because what I have are like concepts like, if I'm thinking of a translative equivalence of the concept of beauty, in my mother tongue is isiZulu, I have the concept of ubuhle. Now, ubuhle has so many meanings, right? In the sense of and it's often complicated by having to qualify it. So if I say something is beautiful in isiZulu, I have to qualify what the beauty is. Is the beauty coming from the character of the thing? Is the beauty coming from the image of the thing? Is it... So when we're thinking about the project of self-reconstitution through sort of an understanding of a pre-colonial aesthetic, I wonder what kinds of clarificatory work we need to do there, Teddy.
Again, your question.
It's big, I know.
But I think you already say it. You know, if you look at young creators today, like young, you know, people who are supposed to be working on aesthetics, everybody is looking for traces of how Africa was, how they mix it, how it becomes modern, Afrofuturism, and all that you see today goes from those traces. So repatriation, in a way, would be to repatriate artifacts, you know, as objects of symbols, which can reconstitute, which can go and stay in Africa, in museums at the time to and recover their signification or their home, and becomes traces of the past to bring them back in scholar programs and to you know to teach, you know, in African programs we learn more about England or Belgium or France than what was there. It's a part of repatriation. You need to repatriate in how can I say it, in education itself. That's the first part. Second is to give access to the new generation on their own aesthetic. Now you talk about the aesthetic, but to give them ways to how the forms were designed at the time, how people were doing their clothes, while they were designing their artifacts themselves. Because Europe have done that for years. If you look at 20th century history of art, you know, it uses a lot African artifacts. So I think that the repatriation can be seen in that way, and they have created their own aesthetic based, you know, all the Picasso and the others were using, you know, African artifacts to inspire Cubism and so and so. And today, our governments as African people, have to think about it in their programs of even development. The last time we talked about development or in their politics as something which can help to reshape, you know, the human being as a, you know, the African identity to to stop the contradiction in our own way of working or acting or trying to walk through what they call development. But from who we are, not from who the others. We are not going to become Chinese tomorrow. We are not going to become French. We need, even our aesthetic, if you talk about our architecture, has to go from somewhere. The weather is different, the landscape is different. We cannot build Chinese buildings and the American buildings in the middle of Africa today, while we have access to our own aesthetics that we can. Some are doing it. Kere and others are starting to recover that. This is restitution. This is a repatriation of a whole thing. So access to these archives can
facilitate
is a political démarche for Africa itself. It's not only activist stuff. It has to go in political programs. It has to be in a AU in Addis Ababa. They have to talk about it. It's in the middle of the policies that Africa. As you talk about environment, as you talk about
health and education.
It's in the middle, and it's health in a way. It's mental health. It helps mental health to get maybe rid of all those people who now bringing new religions, radicalism, or this and that, extremism and this or that. Those objects, those images can help to recover a minimum of identity and humanity, actually.
Now, this debate of aesthetics, and my question really to Mduduzi was the question of how useful the categories are as we find them in the West. Be they aesthetics, be they, I don't know what else, how, because on the other hand, I suppose what I'm concerned about, in specifically in the research that I'm doing about Amagaba in the context of South Africa, I'm concerned about or by the appropriation of particular concepts into this quote-unquote pre-colonial world. Because to this day, those who were classified as Amagaba in South Africa are still fighting against colonial imperialism. To this day. They are still fighting it. And there are some of us indeed who are academics and intellectuals who sit in these global spaces, but who still very much identify with the concept of Ubugaba and subsequently resist Western ways of thinking. But sticking with the notion of the aesthetic, the next two images are very, very interesting for me.
Can we see them somewhere?
So these are the nudes, the nude female, the archival nude image of the female with the calabash on her head, and then of course you've got your Muzungu tribes picture laboratory image of the that is inspired by the work of Sarki Batman. And I'm interested in these two images, if we can call them up, Adam, if they aren't already on the screen. I'm interested in these two images for a number of reasons, right? The first of which is the entire reason behind the appropriation of Sarki Batman to the West, to Europe, is because there is this voyeurism, there is this absolute fascination with, and of course you see it all the time, right, in terms of the colonial European archive now, right? These images of these women who attempt to extend their buttocks through the dresses that have the frames underneath and so forth and so on. And when they encounter the reality of Sarki Batman, there is this voyeurism, and there are these stereotypes, and there's and there are these sexual definitions, right? To the extent that, for example, Yvette Abrahams back at home writes about the dysfunctions and disjunctures that were inaugurated by colonialism. The work of Pumla Gola is also very interesting here. She writes about colonialism and the female body, but she does this beautiful, beautiful piece a couple of years ago, I think in the early 2000s, where she talks about this concept. There's this paper of hers that's titled Ufanele Ukavile, the ways in which femininity is regulated, is policed, etc. Tracing it all back to the subject of Sarki Batman, right, who becomes this sort of globally exported image. And I'm interested specifically in the picture laboratory image as the first one, for example, to say, when you were creating that image, and I know that it is inspired by the discourses of Sarki Batman, what was the intention in the sense of how were you thinking about that particular image, and how were you thinking about the ways in which particular bodies are seen to be the subjects of scientific inquiry and others aren't, and what that has meant. So, and this is the last example, the work, for example, of Zine Makubane, again thinking about the subject of Sarki Batman, demonstrates precisely that point. The science behind the pathologizing of black female subjectivity.
Body, yeah. There's a very nice book in French, fortunately, which is called Corps Noir et Médecins Blancs, Black Bodies and White Doctors, of Isabelle Peretti, I think, which was released like 2 years ago, which talks about the black body and Sarki Batman, actually, and the obsession of science for her body, and how the scientific description of her body was in scientific books for years, up to early 20th century. You know, it was still in the 50s. There was still traces of how to describe the black body, the woman body, and the obsession of the Dr. Cuvier, I think, with her sex, and who really wanted to describe her sex as the sex of all African women, her body as the body of all African women. It was described like that for science. That's one part of the curiosity or the idea of finding she was categorized as part of the wildlife, you know. It was a curiosity, as they were showing lions or giraffes or elephants in the zoo. So that was the first. She was the first black person, I think, shown like in human zoos in Europe, and brought all over to show her body. And we know how she ended, how she died, and how her body was used.
Posthumously, yes.
Yeah. And what's interesting, what I've done with this picture is because she was the first to be a victim of this voyeurism and this business, because she was a business itself. So she was sold, you know, people were paying to see her. So she was as a body, she was a business, as a curiosity, and she was the proof that human beings were different. So there were inferior people close to nature, and some others close to humanity. And as a woman, as a body which was repatriated in honor, like South Africa have done, it was interesting to bring her back in, for me, to bring her back to the new generations, because yes, you have activists now, feminists who knows about her, but for the most of African people, they don't even know those stories. So it was interesting to talk about it, even if I'm not able to spread it as it should be. How to think about the treatment? She was the first at the time, but many more followed. You know, now they started to make it a big business, and the human zoos in all over Europe were a business where they were bringing like hundreds of people, keeping them for 6 months, bringing them everywhere, cannibals, Senegalese, drummers, hunters, Aborigine, this or that, people from all over, even Japanese. And it was a business, the business of the others, you know. People, they had no TV, they had no football, so people were coming to see the cannibals dancing and eating fresh meat. Yes, the idea was to show how far racism and capitalism and entertainment have you know met on the white and on the black body, on the black, and we have the name, we have the person, we have the traces. So it was interesting to come and talk about it, but without coming like I'm doing a revenge. It's not, it doesn't interest me. What interests me is the stereotypes and what have been created, and the idea, how many people have seen her, how many people went to Human Zoo, how many people have got a small postcard at home, you know. Yeah. So it was all that, yeah.
And this contrasts very nicely with the follow-up image in terms of this now, the black female nude form with the calabash, and then you've got sort of this anthropological white male gaze standing right beside her, you know, which is the next image that we have. And I'm interested in that, in the sense of, as you say, for example, this is an image that's found in the Africa Museum image archives. The female subject is not named. They will, as you say, Europeans would name rivers, they would name elephants, they would name lions, they would name all of these things, but the female subject is not named. And I'm sitting with that idea of the unnamed female subject for two reasons. The first is, on the one hand, can that process of not naming be seen to be useful? Because on the other hand, it would have been the appropriation, or sort of the imposition rather, of a name. So not necessarily because Europeans came to Africa and they couldn't speak our languages. We were the ones who had to learn their languages. And to this day, Europeans are all over the world, and they cannot, you know, it reminds me of the first episode that we had with Niaikwe Parks, and he talks about the fact that, you know, the British, to this day, colonized the entire world. And we know, for example, Telugu and English. We will know Bemba and English. We will know isiZulu and English. We will know Kiswahili and English. We will. It was never an imagined idea to say let's learn the languages. So on the one hand, one can find it to be a form of erasure, but on the other hand, I wonder, would it have not been a more epistemically problematic erasure to sort of impose a name on somebody who was never supposed to be named in the first instance by white folks?
Yes, it's a good idea to bring names back. But first, there's no names for black people, women or not. Second, you have thousands of pictures of naked African women in those archives. The idea of the naked black woman was quite central when people were going in Africa with all the dangers, with malaria and so. The idea of being in a world of thousands of women topless and naked was in the middle of the idea of the trip. Even on the campaign in France they were doing to recruit people for the army, colonial army, or for doctors to go to Africa, in Central Africa, for French Africa colonies, French Empire, as they were calling them. You always had a naked black woman or a topless black woman on the chief, like what you can see in Europe, because all women are covered, exist over there. So you can go and see all those. So you find them on the pictures, on many pictures, as an exotic object, as a part of the nature, this wild world. And they are never named. Or sometimes they say a beauty. A beauty of near the river, a beauty. They name the river, but they won't name the person. So it's very funny. It would be interesting to try to give them some names, or to try to to go back to the villages and ask, if you know this person?
Yes.
Someone
What
have,
was the
have an
name?
idea.
Yes. Because also the realities of it are the fact that these are images that were taken. So if for example we would go back to our grandparents and show them these images, they would actually be able to remember some of the people.
It would be possible. It's a part of repatriation and what we do with those pictures and it was part of the propaganda itself. We are bringing close to those people who are naked in the bush. We are bringing civilization.
We're bringing light. We're bringing
sometimes you have
enlightenment.
those naked and people called cannibals or whatever, and on the other side you have young kids at school learning as the colonial work is being done. So we are taking them from artifacts, from being naked, and we bring them to school. Yeah.
Now the next image, Teddy, and you've sort of been intimating to this a bit in our conversation, is an image that sort of styles a row of about three black men in chains, talking about them as cannibals, as it were. And I'm thinking about, for example, this particular image reminds me of the psychoanalytic theory that we find in the work of Frantz Fanon. The idea of having to chain black masculinity, of having to control and tame black masculinity. And then, of course, this also, takes me to more recent scholarship that we find in the work of Murray Miller-Young and Xavier Liverman, who also talk about and explore the question of race bodies as fetishized objects, as you say, beauty by the river, etc., these kinds of things. And so when we think about this image, I'm curious about, and I'm reminded here of the work of J.M. Coetzee in that interesting and fascinating tale that he did titled Waiting for the Barbarians. And there's an interesting exchange that happens between, quote unquote, a native barbarian and the colonel. And for those who haven't seen the film, I'd say start with the book and then go to the film. In the film, Johnny Depp plays the colonel. And there's this beautiful exchange between the prisoner native, quote-unquote, barbarian and the colonel, and that line always stayed with me. J.M. Coetzee sets up this dialogue, and the native asks, you have persecuted us, you have used so much violence to get a truth of when the hordes of the barbarians will descend. Who between you and I, now this is the native asking the white colonel, who between you and I do you think is the actual barbarian, right? So I'm interested if you could just say a bit more about that. Again, this is an image that we find in the archive, in the African Museum, and contrasting that, for example, with, again, the Photolab image of the white man in the suit that has them the search and the pursuit of the human in the dehumanizing and inhumane ways in which European whiteness has treated, specifically the people of the Congo, specifically in the DRC. I wonder if you could just say a bit about that in the sense of those two.
This picture is interesting because when you look at the picture without looking at the caption, you will not know if it was taken in America or in Africa. This picture is especially interesting because the treatment was quite the same. They talk about colonization and slavery, but there's a connection. They transformed some, one in another to exploit Africa when it was not possible to to go on with slavery if segregation was on. So, and the caption is the punishment of the cannibals, something like that. The punishment of the cannibals, which was like, we take the picture because we are punishing. We find the wild world when people are eating one another, and those cannibals, we are unchaining them. And there's another picture that I found where there were the first armed groups created to help the colony, the Belgian colony, were chosen among the villages which were supposed to be villages of cannibals, which is funny because they were using the idea of that those people were dangerous or were scared of the others to use them as an enforcement for the colony. So this picture is interesting because the way they are treated, the way they look, the way they are named, assigned, the whole country or the whole idea of Africa in their condition, what they call them, in what they call them, and they are not only prisoners. They are imprison all of us. It's like imprisoning all of us in this idea of being sauvage and being needing them help to change. So it's that's why I choose it to show you, to give you an idea of how they were describing us, and those pictures were found on postcards as well.
And I'm conscious of time here, Teddy. In the sense of our interview is nearly coming to an end, but the last image that we have is an image of black folk out in a field, again in chains. And the caption for that image is "the bad Negroes," or something to that effect. And if we could call that image up, Adam. But I'm interested exactly in this thing that you're talking about, which is to say, it's indistinguishable. You can look at some of the images that come out of the same period in the United States, and you go to the African continent, in the Congo region, and you have exactly the same images. I wonder, as a way of concluding our conversation, I really do wonder how Belgian society is dealing with the past, with its past of King Leopold's brutality. Is this a conversation that is happening in terms of the social debates that are happening, be it in Brussels, be it in broader Belgium society? Or is it a conversation that, and I ask this question in relation, for example, to the ways in which the Germans confronted their own atrocities of the Holocaust.
We are not yet there. No. There's a commission which was set up after George Floyd, actually. George Floyd had the wave of the emotion of George Floyd have, in Europe, provoked some reactions of the community, the Black Lives Matters in Brussels. You had Black Lives Matters everywhere. We had a huge demonstration in the middle of the COVID crisis. So there is a commission in Brussels which started a few years ago, since the time, and they had the resolution, but they couldn't agree on it. So now they brought it back. You have the resolution there, but they couldn't vote it. So Belgium is still in its own contradiction between nostalgic of Leopold II and people who wants to change and recognize what happened, but they can't even retribute what they have taken to the Congo. So if they open it, they went so far in economic exploitation and so that starting on a point would be difficult for them to. If they open something, they will have to open everything. So they will do it sooner or later, but it will come. So to help you finishing with this picture. This picture is called the Mauvais Nègre, punishment of the Mauvais Nègre. So which means punishment of the bad Negro. I was so happy to find this picture because I was happy because I knew that there was not only good niggers. There were bad boys and bad niggers in front of the colonization. I think it was like, it's a title of a book here.
Absolutely, and on that note, Teddy,
people resisted.
Absolutely,
people resisted.
Absolutely, and I think that's, when thinking about the work that we've been doing and the work that we will continue to do on the series, it's to think exactly about that: systems of resistance of blackness across the African continent, systems of resistance in the diaspora where people were taken against their will, and again. The shared experiences of being black, whether I am black in Africa, whether I am black in Europe, whether I am black in the Americas, whether I am black in the Caribbean, the experience of being black.
Even South Africa would be different.
You see,
at Cape Town or Joburg would be different.
Absolutely, and in the differences, the curiosity of the similarities, you see, is what I find fascinating. So thank you very much for joining us for the second part of our conversation. I am humbled and very, very grateful for having had you here at Harvard, that we could have the opportunity of hosting you and hosting your work. And I think what's important for our viewers to also note is the reality that the discourses of these images continue to have bearing today, specifically in the Congo, Rwanda space, where we are still fighting against, for example, the challenges of the Hutu-Tutsi distinctions, classifications, and of course the resurgences.
Resurgences and social medias today, people, it's very funny when you search a bit on Twitter or somewhere else, people are using exactly the same language which was used by the colonizers on those captions, describing their own self or their neighbors. So hatred, like hate speech in the sub-region, inter-African racism, is using exactly the same identity assignments made by the colonization. So it's interesting to go back into the caption and bring them, show them people saying, you are just repeating what
was said.
What was said. It's not you.
And what was invented of you.
The assignment that they gave you, you kept it. You didn't change. You didn't move in your mind.
Absolutely.
So the young generation is using them without knowing even where it comes from or what it means.
No, Teddy, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time. And to our viewers, I look forward to welcoming you once again next week to another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast. See you next week.
Thank you.